Good afternoon, and welcome to Research in Action, brought to you by the Division of Research at Florida Atlantic University. My name is Karen Scapinato. I work at FAU, and I will be your moderator for today's presentation. Due to the number of attendees we typically have at these presentations, we cannot allow audio questions, but we are very interested in hearing your questions and will make every attempt to answer them at the end of the presentation. If you hover your mouse at the bottom of your screen, you will see a Q&A button there. When you click that Q&A button, a little pop-up will come up and you can type your questions in there at any time during the presentation. When our presenter is done with his presentation today, we will go through as many questions as we can and answer them. Those we don't get to during our time today, we will collect and answer them and put the question and answers on our website together with a recording of our presentation here. With that, it is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Jason Hallstrom is the director of the Institute for Sensing and Embedded Network Systems Engineering, or short iSense, at Florida Atlantic University. The institute really focuses on the Internet of Everything, and has divided its projects into 3 tracks, which cover infrastructure systems, marine and environment, and health and behavior. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Hallstrom, who's going to talk about smart toothbrushes and COVID. Welcome.
Thanks so much. I'm hoping everybody can see this and that I'm not just talking to myself sitting here at the desk. If I am just sitting here talking to myself, Karen, please text me and let me know. Good afternoon. Thanks so much for joining us for another virtual Research in Action series. Even if it's not in person, it is really a pleasure to speak with you this afternoon. And Karen is texting me, and I'm going to make sure that you can all hear me. And it's good, so thanks. So again, my name is Jason Hallstrom. I have the pleasure of directing Florida Atlantic University's Institute for Sensing and Embedded Network Systems Engineering. That doesn't roll off of the tongue, and so we just call that iSense. I'm going to talk more about iSense later in the presentation today, but in a nutshell, our team is focused on building a connected future, a future where we have transparent visibility into our oceans, our rivers, our buildings, our cars, our bodies, our behaviors. And we call that future the Internet of Things, or the Internet of Everything. And that's going to be the focus of today's talk, the past, the present, and the future of the Internet of Things and the many, many applications that it enables. Now, I suspect that many folks on the call today have heard of the Internet of Things, or they've heard of the acronym IoT. So what is IoT all about? When you hear about the Internet of Things, it sounds like this very futuristic idea that fell straight out of the pages of a science fiction magazine, where we have sensing, computing, communication, and robotic control woven throughout the fabric of our everyday experience, where our roads, our buildings, our kitchens, and all of the various things that populate our lives can talk to one another, can learn about how we interact with those devices, can communicate, and can sort of seamlessly optimize the world around us. Now, when you hear that kind of vision, it can sound very, very complicated, but in fact, the Internet of Things has been around for a very long time, and it's not complicated at all. So let's take this idea of the Internet of Things and break it down to the most simple example. So an example that I like very much is the Nest thermostat. And I suspect that many folks on the call today have a Nest thermostat at home. So the folks at Nest did something very interesting. They took a traditional everyday object, just a thermostat stuck on your wall, and they integrated sensing, computing, and communication. So the Nest thermostat has the ability to sense occupancy, to know when there are people in the room. It has the ability to compute trends and patterns so that we understand the daily patterns of when people are in the house and when they're outside the house. And then they integrated communication, the ability of that thermostat to communicate with an HVAC system so that the Nest thermostat can cool your house before you go home, and then it can turn that thermostat off just before you leave home so that you can conserve energy. That's been hugely successful. So the sort of the natural question is, if the idea is so simple, just taking sensing, computing, and communication and integrating it in everyday objects, why is industry so excited about this? So to understand why industry is so excited, I want you to take this idea of the simple thermostat and I want you to multiply that picture in your head by 4. So you have 4 thermostats. And now I want you to multiply that by 100 and 100 again, and 100 again, and 100 again, and 100 again. And that is why industry is so excited, because that is the scale of connectivity that we expect to see in just the next couple of years. So let's put that into perspective. So today on the planet, we have about 75 billion people, and 7.5 billion rather. And by 2025, we're going to have about 8 billion people. Now, in that same year, 2025, we'll have more than 41 billion connected things. Way more devices communicating on the internet than there are people. And that's everything from toothbrushes to cars to cell phones and kind of everything in between. So that's why industry is so excited about the Internet of Things. And it turns out that when you have that many devices that can sense and learn about their environment and communicate, very exciting futures become possible. But again, this is an old idea. It's been around for a very long time. And so I'd like to sort of jump back in time a bit to understand where the Internet of Things began and how we got to where we are. So again, this is an old idea, and I want to really jump back way to the beginning. So back in the 1950s, one of the very first systems that demonstrated distributed sensing was a system called SOSUS, and this stands for the Sound Surveillance System. So this was a long-range early detection system that was designed by the US military for safeguarding the coast from ballistic missile submarines, which at the time were perceived to be the greatest threat to the US homeland. Now, this wasn't a whole bunch of wireless sensors. Instead, this was a series of hydrophones that were designed to capture low-frequency sound waves, and they were deployed off Eleuthera. This is an island in the Bahamas. So they had 40 of these hydrophones, and these hydrophones were arranged in an array that was about 1,000 foot long and about 240 fathoms of water. And these hydrophones, all of these 40 sort of microphones underwater, were all physically tethered to a processing center on the island where you had physical observers who were watching the signals coming back on the hydrophone array. And these analysts were able to detect the presence of submarines, to classify submarines, and to track the movement of those submarines. Now that system was used all the way up until the 1980s, when it was ultimately turned over to the university system in the U.S., where it's been used primarily for tracking marine mammals, studying marine mammals. Now, if we jump forward 2 decades and we move from the 50s to the 70s, we start to see the Internet of Things kind of take shape. So in 1972, the first well-documented telemetered, which just means wirelessly transmitting sensor, was installed right here in Florida, as it turns out. So this wireless sensor was deployed in partnership with NASA and the US Geological Survey. And this was installed to measure water levels in the Everglades. So the way that this system worked was that this sensor in the Everglades would, every couple of hours, would take a sample of water level within the Everglades. It would transmit that up to NavSat. That satellite feed would send that information to the Goddard Space Flight Center in Maryland, and the Goddard Space Flight Center in Maryland would teletype the water level readings out to all of the USGS offices in the region in South Florida. So what real time meant back in the 1970s was about a 2-hour round trip delay. Now, ultimately, this system became the foundation of the USGS, the USGS water monitoring system, or the National Water Information System, which has thousands of sensors measuring water level and all kinds of water parameters all over the country. Now, if we jump forward 1 more decade, we start to see very deep investments in wireless sensing technology through DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. So DARPA began to put their muscle, their money behind the sensor networking community through a program called DSN, the Distributed Sensor Networks Program. And it's interesting that the Distributed Sensor Networks Program, which was focused on global scale sensing technology, was actually led by one of the inventors of the internet. And so this was led by one of the inventors of the internet who was working at DARPA and who was already thinking about how could we use a global communication infrastructure to enable distributed sensing. And DSN resulted in some very, very interesting applications. One focused on the use of a range of different wireless technologies for doing real-time tracking of aircraft in battle space scenarios. So now we're going to jump forward to the 1990s, and this is when the Big Bang happened, again with DARPA paving the way. They had two programs that they invested in, both run through universities, one called SENSIT, which was focused on information technology for large-scale sensing. So the thought behind this program was, if we had a world filled with sensors that were communicating data, what type of algorithms, what type of information processing infrastructure would we need to make sense of that huge volume of data? And then there was a program called NEST, Network Embedded Sensor Technology, that kind of wrapped back around the program that began in the 80s to look at how do we enable global scale wireless sensing. And this program revolutionized wireless sensor networking, and it enabled what we think of as the Internet of Things today. It generated new hardware platforms that were very small, the size of a matchbox, which could be embedded in volcanoes, embedded in cars. They could be used on farms. They could be used virtually in any type of environment to collect information about the environment or to actuate, to change something within the environment. And that opened the door to lots and lots of different applications, ranging from the monitoring of bridges and civil infrastructure, buildings, radiological hazards, measuring of invasive species like the cane toad in Australia, wind farms, and everything in between. And so that's really what kicked off the Internet of Things, were these deep DARPA investments in the 80s and 90s. Now, it's an interesting thing that the Internet of Things, that terminology, could actually have been called the Internet of Lipstick. So this branding, Internet of Things, this name, came from a brand manager who was working at Procter & Gamble. His name was Kevin Ashton. And Ashton was intrigued by the idea of a lipstick case that could communicate its contents. So the idea was that if you had a lipstick case that was sitting out for customers, and someone took the last shade of pink, nobody knew. And so there was no real way to sort of inform further down the supply chain that new lipstick ought to be shipped. So Ashton and the team developed a simple lipstick case that had RFID readers beneath the case, and then they used RFID tags, those tags that you find in the back of your books at Amazon, you find them in grocery stores. It looks just like a little square label with a metal antenna embedded in it, and they stuck those beneath the lipstick, and then the case could determine in real time which lipstick shades were present, and then they could notify managers when the lipstick case needed to be replenished. Now, this was a simple implementation, but this idea of using RFID, radio frequency ID tags, really, again, ushered in a revolution in supply chain management. So this was picked up as a blueprint for global retailers all over the planet, retailers like Walmart, who rely on this kind of simple, monotonous, silent chatter of shirts and razors and all kinds of other goods to manage their global supply chain. So the Internet of Things began with the military, and it was realized by lipstick. So it's a pretty interesting story. So now let's just jump ahead a little bit. And when I grabbed this image off the internet, I was saddened a little bit, because I went to check in Back to the Future how far ahead could Marty jump, and it turns out that the latest date imagined was 2015, which is sort of a sad state of affairs. But nonetheless, we'll jump ahead to 2020 and see where we are. So the Internet of Things is fully fully realized in the sense that the technology foundations are available. We're already starting to see massive growth in the commercial market. We're seeing smart farms, we see smart cars, we have smart buildings and smart hospitals and smart this and smart that, and of course we have smart homes. So if you have a birthday coming up and you're looking for a gift for yourself, or you're looking for a loved one to get you a gift, all of these IoT devices are available on Amazon for purchase. And so it's everything from smart crock pots to smart toothbrushes to smart pillows and smart refrigerators that will measure the freshness of your food to smart hairbrushes that will, as you're stroking your Goldilocks, will tell you about the quality and health of your hair if you need such things. I do not, but if you do, these are available at Amazon. Now that we have a sense of sort of where IoT began and where IoT is now in the marketplace, I want to take some time and I want to fairly quickly move through what's happening in our own backyard here at Florida Atlantic. So as Karen mentioned at the beginning of the talk, the Institute for Sensing and Embedded Network Systems Engineering, we have applications in 3 primary areas. We have applications in marine and environment, in infrastructure systems, and health and behavior. And so what I'm going to do for the rest of the talk today is I'm going to very quickly zip through how Florida Atlantic is building IoT technology and how we're deploying IoT technology to solve important problems across these 3 application areas. Now, in the first area, we have built new technology for protecting our natural resources, specifically for monitoring and protecting freshwater resources. In the US today, we're going to consume about 408 billion gallons of water. That's about 1,430 gallons of water per person. It's about 8 billion bathtubs of water. It's enough water to fill the Empire State Building about 1,470 times. So today we've got about approximately 328 million people living in the United States. By 2025, we're going to have 350 million people. And so that, of course, creates a tension between the demand for fresh water and the supply. So we've constructed technology that's deployed along freshwater systems for measuring the quality of that water in real time and transmitting that information to water management agencies. So this is a system that we called the environmental macroscope. The pictures that you see up there today come from the Savannah River Basin, where we deployed this infrastructure from headwaters to port. That's about 212, 220 river miles. And we were measuring water quality along that stretch of river, along with water quality within the soil in the basin that drains down into the river. So these were primarily physical parameters. So we were looking at things like the dissolved oxygen, the amount of suspended sort of gunk, the turbidity of the water, several other parameters. And we were collecting that information all along the riverway. Now the idea is that if you have an understanding of the quality of the water upstream, downstream, and the quality of the water that's draining down into the basin, then you can make more informed decisions about when you time your water withdrawals for drinking water, when you time your dam release events, and other water management actions. So as one example that I like very much, we had a dense instrumentation of water quality monitors that were installed in an agricultural corridor. We also had weather stations. So when we would see a precipitation event in this agricultural corridor where there were lots and lots of animals and lots of animal poop, we knew that when that water made its way into this, or when that water made its way through the soil, that would have a negative impact on water quality within the Savannah Basin. And so this was information that could be used to time management actions. Now, of course, when you have that kind of infrastructure deployed from headwaters to port, you need fantastic tools for your water management agencies to understand what's happening within the water system. And so what you see up here is a set of tools that we developed that were used by the EPA, used by the Army Corps of Engineers to gain access to the data that we were collecting through these devices. So these devices, to sort of dig a little bit into the technology, these devices included the water quality instrument, which collects, again, information on water quality. That information is collected by a small computer that's housed within a buoy that floats on the water surface. And then that information is transmitted wirelessly to the cloud, to this, and cloud is just fancy talk for computers that live somewhere and you don't know where they are. So that's how this system worked. Now these tools allow the water management agencies and other end users to look at historical information, what happened along the stretch, and also to look at what's happening right now. So this is work that was supported through the Department of the Interior, through the USDA, the Army Corps, and the National Science Foundation. Now it turns out that this technology had all kinds of interesting uses, and we were later approached by a municipality in northwest South Carolina called the city of Aiken, South Carolina. And the city of Aiken, South Carolina continues to have a stormwater management problem. So Aiken is a historic town that kind of grew organically over time, and all of their stormwater infrastructure funnels out into a single 10-foot, or rather two 10-foot diameter pipes into an adjacent urban forest called Hitchcock Woods. So it's interesting when you're in Aiken and you see just a little bit of rainfall, and then you take a look at the outflow in the forest from those pipes, it is just a huge outrush of water. And that water, in the course of less than a generation, carved a canyon in Hitchcock Woods. It was effectively destroying the wetlands. And so you see there a picture of what this canyon looks like. That's about 35 foot deep. In its widest part, it's about 70 foot wide. It's carved entirely out of stormwater. So what does that have to do with sensing? Well, the city was interested in becoming a leader in green infrastructure practices for stormwater. They were interested in installing new methods for keeping the water within the soil rather than allowing that water to make its way into the stormwater system and then get flushed out that 10-foot diameter pipe. So we built a system for the city that provides a water balance. So we measure through sensing the amount of precipitation that comes into the system. We measure the amount of moisture that's maintained within the soil, within the green space throughout the city. We measured the amount of water that made its way into the stormwater system. We measured the flow and quality of that water within the pipes themselves, within the collection system. And then we measured the quantity and quality of the water that came out of the outflow. That provided a very powerful tool for the city to understand, as they installed these best management practices for stormwater, what was the return on investment that they were seeing? What was the impact that they were seeing? Now that was work that was supported by the EPA and also by the National Science Foundation. Now moving ahead a little bit further, variations on this technology have been used by Florida Atlantic to build something called the Southeast Atlantic Mesonet. This is a collection of about approximately 100 atmospheric sensing stations that are deployed from South Florida all the way up through North Carolina. And we're collecting information about weather and atmosphere. And that information is collected and transmitted to a modeling system in North Carolina that's used for forecasting extreme weather events along the Atlantic coast. And it's also transmitted to the National Weather Service and is incorporated as part of the national forecasting models. So FAU's technology is being used to reduce the cost of ownership for weather networks and to expand weather networks along the Atlantic coast so that we have improved weather forecasting accuracy because of course, we have a vested interest in understanding when tropical storms will hit, where tropical storms will hit, and the impacts that we ought to expect. A related project that we've worked on is focused on inland flood forecasting. Now, if we take a look at the frequency and intensity of tropical storms over the last 15 years, we see a year-by-year increase in frequency and intensity. Now, if we take a look at where does the majority of damage come from, the most important damage, of course, is loss of life. And I think many people will be surprised to learn that when a hurricane makes its way up the Atlantic coast, the majority of deaths do not come from wind, they do not come from debris, they come from flooding. And what's even more surprising is that that flooding tends to be inland flooding, flooding that's more than 25 miles away from the coast. So the general idea is that as that tropical storm makes its way and seems to always beeline for Boca and then kind of hug the coast as it makes its way up into the Carolinas, it dumps a huge amount of rain into our canals, into our soil, into Lake O. It dumps all this water, and the land is like a sponge that becomes saturated. Now, as the eye of that storm makes its way up further, those outer bands of the storm drop more water. That water hits the land, it has nowhere to go, and it moves laterally. And that's the water that's the flooding, that inland flooding that results in the most serious damage. Now, it turns out that our ability to forecast inland flooding is not good. So to take as one example, the forecasts that we received when Hurricane Irma was approaching Boca, the forecasts that we received put the water levels we should anticipate between 5 and 20 foot. Now that forecast is crazy. A forecast of 5 foot says that we should be prepared for inconvenient times. A forecast of 20 foot says that we should be prepared for catastrophe. A forecast of 5 to 20 foot, you can't do anything with that. So we need better models, we need better tools to forecast inland and coastal flooding. And that's the technology that we've built at FAU. So I won't get too far into the details, but the key to being able to forecast inland flooding, the amount of flooding we'll see from our inland rivers and streams as a result of hurricane impacts, depends in a critical way on what's happening at the surface of the water before the hurricane makes landfall. So the devices that you see on the screen here, these are actually quite similar to the technology that you see inside of a drone, inside of a UAV that folks sort of fly around the neighborhoods here. So we're collecting information on acceleration, on rotation, on GPS, right at the surface of the water. So before a storm, this is just a pilot that you see here, a little test that we ran. Before the storm comes, these devices are put within the waterways, or they're released from within the waterways. And as they float down the stream, they're collecting information on what's happening at the water's surface. That information is transmitted to a modeling system up in North Carolina that's used for forecasting inland flooding impacts. We have a new version of this technology that's been developed to monitor storm surge in real time. That is the surge level that we see as the hurricane is approaching and hugging that Atlantic coastline. This is work that's been supported through the National Science Foundation in partnership with our friends and colleagues at Coastal Carolina University, led by Paul Gaze and his team. This gives you a sense of what that data looks like. Again, this is just a pilot that I'm showing you here with a canal in Boca. And of course, you can see the little red pins where GPS samples have been taken as I was making my way from the car to throw the device into the waterway. And then you can see information on acceleration and gyro. Gyro is just the amount of rotation that's happening on the water's surface. Now, in the infrastructure systems area, we have another project with a water focus, but quite different. So we're focused in this case on irrigation infrastructure. So we talked earlier that in the US today, we're going to consume about 408 billion gallons of fresh water. About 138 billion of those gallons will go toward irrigation, agricultural and residential irrigation. Now it turns out that those irrigation systems can leak a tremendous amount of water. So the average US household leaks about 10,000 gallons of water per year across all sources. And so that's about enough water to do 270 loads of laundry, and that's on average leaked from every home in the country. That's a crazy amount of water. So we became interested in how do we detect water leaks within irrigation systems. And there are really two sources we need to consider. There are above ground leaks and below ground leaks. The above ground leaks are easy to detect because you can see them, but the underground leaks are hard to see. So we developed with a team of undergraduate researchers at FAU a system that measures the flow of water through the irrigation system at multiple points, and then using tools can can learn the normal flow of water through the irrigation system, and when there are variations in that flow, pinpoint the source of a leak underground. Now, the interesting point here is, after you've installed this sensor technology within the irrigation system, and these devices are measuring and transmitting to the home so that a model can be built of flow across the whole irrigation system, how do you change the batteries? And the answer is you don't. This is a completely battery-free system. There are no batteries of any kind. The system collects information, or rather collects energy from the flow of water through the irrigation system. It stores that energy temporarily in a capacitor, something called a supercapacitor, which is like a super tiny version of what's inside of a Prius. And then it uses that power to take a water sample that is a flow sample, to communicate that information to a computer in the house, and to go back to sleep. So that's how this system works. Now, we're going to change focus a little bit here, and I want to talk about smart cities. Now, ordinarily, when we talk about smart cities, we're focused on things. We're focused on automating vehicles, on automating water, on automating electricity. But if we focus only on automation in smart cities, we're losing an important piece of the puzzle. The greatest opportunities, the greatest efficiencies we will see from the smart cities of the future, these sort of technology hotspots filled with sensors and actuators, the greatest benefits are going to come from changes we can induce in people's behaviors. So as one example, we've focused for some time on food waste reduction. So in the United States, about 30 to 40% of our food supply every year is wasted. That's about 133 billion pounds of food. The market value of that food is about $161 billion. That food is wasted. That food goes into landfills. It generates a significant portion of methane, which is one of the more important greenhouse gases. I forget the number exactly. It's between 13 and 16%. So food waste is a significant problem. Can we encourage people to waste less? So we built a pilot for this project, and the pilot is fairly simple. The idea is we would measure the amount of food that was wasted by measuring the contents of a garbage can, food waste within a garbage can, and we would then install those garbage cans within cafeteria-style eateries. So we installed these in the Atlantic Dining Hall, and we measured the amount of food waste that accumulated over time. Now, as we collected information on how much food was being wasted in the dining hall, we displayed that information on a display at the point of purchase, and we showed the customers how much food was being wasted each day and how that waste compared to normal. And it turns out that this idea of social norming, comparing your behaviors with the behaviors of your friends and neighbors, is one of the most important psychological tools in influencing your behavior. This is why the electric company probably tells you how your electric consumption compares to your neighbors, because that's what changes our behavior. It's not just telling you this is absolutely good, this is absolutely bad. It's saying your neighbor does this and you ought to do it too. So that's kind of the idea. So we deployed this system for about 1 year in the Atlantic Dining Hall. And this system, by providing a number of different types of displays at the point of purchase, we were able to significantly reduce food waste by about 18% in our pilots. That's a staggering number. And that's staggering because in every state in the whole country, we have food insecurity. A 16% reduction in food waste, if that food could be distributed evenly, would solve in food insecurity. So this 18% number is very, very important. We are very excited. And it also resulted in one of my very favorite pictures of a graduate student that I've ever had. And it's that picture. I call this Things You Didn't Know You Do or Smell in Graduate School. This is Cherie Hughes. She earned her Ph.D. at Florida Atlantic now about 1.5 years ago. And she led this project in the dining hall. Now she works at Motorola Solutions. So the final topic that I'm going to talk about today is a so-called cross-cutting topic that touches upon infrastructure, that touches upon marine and environment, that touches upon health and behavior. And it's focused on a concept called mobility intelligence. mobility intelligence is a concept that refers to our ability to understand precisely where people, vehicles, bicycles, scooters, skateboards are in real time throughout a city. Now, that doesn't mean knowing who the people are or having information about the people. It only means understanding where the people are and how they're moving about. So before I talk about what that information might be useful for, I want to talk about how can you figure out where someone is? How can you find out where a person is standing or where they're walking? And the key observation is that we all carry devices of some kind that are always silently communicating. We wear smart watches, we have smart rings, we have smart necklaces, we have mobile phones, our cars have cell phones, we've got all these devices that are always talking, even when we're not. So your devices are always trying to communicate, and they're sending out a beacon of sorts, sort of saying, is there something I could connect to and speak with? Now, if you listen for those signals, and you listen to their volume, the strength at which you receive the signal, then you can estimate how far away the device is. So if I had a cell phone that was laying in the middle of the street and I could listen for its beacon, I could estimate how far away that cell phone is. And then if I had 5 or 6 stations that were listening, then they could all estimate how far away that device might be, and then they could triangulate its position. They could identify where that device is in space. So that's the idea. We have a project that began in August of 2019. This is in partnership with the city of West Palm Beach and with the support of the Knight Foundation and the Community Foundation of Palm Beach and Martin counties, that's focused on enabling mobility intelligence all along Clematis Street in the heart of downtown West Palm Beach. So the purple dots that you see there, those are the listening stations that we're in the process of installing. And these listening stations listen for the beacon messages that come from your devices, that come from your watches and your phones and your necklaces and all your other communicating gadgets. And then that gives us the ability to understand how many people are downtown and where are they downtown, and then how do those people move? That information is extremely valuable. Of course, there's important information for emergency management there, but we can also use that information to understand how the city's mobility projects are affecting mobility. So if the city makes an investment in, for example, tree canopy on one side of the road, we can measure the impact that that tree canopy had in driving business traffic to that side of the street. We can also take that information, that mobility data, that pathway information on how people are moving around, and overlay that on top of business district data to understand how our business is being frequented, how our mobility changes in the city affecting business traffic, and of course, how does that ultimately affect tax revenue? This is an extremely exciting project. We've installed now 4 listening stations, and we'll be installing many more in the coming weeks and months. So this is a very exciting project. Now, it turns out that in this very strange COVID-19 era, mobility intelligence, smart cities can take on an even more significant role. So to understand why this mobility data is so important in understanding pandemics like COVID-19 and forecasting how that pandemic might play out within a city, it's important to understand how epidemiologists model and forecast disease spread, the infectious disease spread. One of the tools that they use is something called an agent-based model. And an agent-based model is a little bit like that game SimCity, for those who have seen it. The idea is that you're simulating people or agents, and you're simulating their characteristics, their pre-existing conditions. You're simulating their behaviors, how they move, how they interact with others, whether they cough. And then you're simulating on top of that how the disease might spread between agents over time. So I pulled just a very recent paper by Cuevas from 2020, just recently came out, just to pull a picture to show you how these models are normally conducted. And these are computer-based simulations where these dots represent people milling about and moving and interacting. In this case, the little red dot represents someone who has an infection of some kind. And as these folks move around, that infection, depending on behaviors and depending on proximity, that infection may spread through the simulation. That's the idea. Now, traditional models, agent-based simulations, rely on synthetic mobility patterns. So these are fake mobility patterns that we simulate infection spread on top of. But if we had real information at the level of a streetscape on how people are actually moving today and how they interact today, then you can simulate on top of that real mobility data infection spread. That is an enormously powerful idea. If you have, at the level of a streetscape, real mobility patterns, and you can simulate in real time how a disease might spread based on the way people currently move, that's an extremely powerful tool for city managers, for emergency operations folks, to understand how could mobility patterns be improved within the city to reduce the likelihood of viral transmission in the future. That's an incredibly powerful smart cities tool that represents something fundamentally new for city managers. I think it's very, very exciting. We found out recently, again in cooperation with our outstanding partners in the city of West Palm Beach, and with the generous support of the Community Foundation of Palm Beach and Martin counties, that we're going to be able to engage in some early pilot work exploring this idea. Now, of course, we just found this out. The project has not officially begun, but I wanted to give you a sense of what this kind of simulation might look like, how it might work. Again, this is a simulation. It is not a real model. I don't have real mobility data yet, but again, I wanted to show you how this works in practice. So I built a simple simulation from an aerial view on top of my neighborhood. So the view you see is just an overhead shot of my neighborhood. All of the yellow dots on the screen represent healthy people milling about through their daily lives. Now there's a red dot. Hopefully you can see it. Let me see if I can highlight it for you. This little red dot over here represents someone who has an illness, and that illness is contagious. And so now I'm going to show you, as we simulate the behavior of this infection over time. And so you can see people milling about, and you can see this infection jumping from one host to another, and we'll speed it up because it's not particularly fun to watch it run over and over. And at the same time, you can keep track in this simulated environment of how many active infections there are, how many recoveries there are. You can keep track of the mortality rate. And so this is becomes a planning tool, for example, to be used in understanding the ICU limits that might be hit based on current mobility patterns. This is an extremely exciting idea. I'm incredibly grateful we're going to have an opportunity to work on this. Now, if we look to the future, what is going to happen with the Internet of Things? So in the years ahead, we're going to see devices continue to become smaller and smaller and smaller. We're going to see devices consume less and less energy. We're going to see these devices able to harvest energy from their environments, from ambient energy sources, and we're going to continue to see significant advancements in artificial intelligence and in machine learning. When you have devices that can operate in perpetuity without anyone touching them, and they have the ability to silently communicate and to learn over time, that creates an incredibly exciting future for the Internet of Things. So there's a great quote that comes from Arthur C. Clarke that says that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. That's the technology that we're building at Florida Atlantic. And I'm very grateful that I had the opportunity to share that with you today, even if we're not in person. So with that, thanks very much for your time. I'm going to turn it back over to Karen, and I'm happy to address any questions that you might have.
Great. Thank you very much, Jason. As a reminder, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A button in the bottom of your screen and type your questions. Now, Jason, with all the data that you're collecting, whether it's on infections or just mobility or any other data, most of the questions that we've received, and probably not to your surprise, are on privacy. How is privacy being managed? And then in an extension to that, how do you save yourself from malicious use or hackers, the government, and any kind of malicious use?
So those are both excellent questions. So let me talk about privacy first. So I think when we look at the range of projects that we've talked about today, and we probably talked about more than I should have put in there, probably the one that rings the privacy bells is the Mobility Intelligence Project. So here we're looking at understanding where people are and how people are moving about. Privacy is extraordinarily important to us. This is something long before we began this project, in fact, probably a year before we began this project, we began discussing with the city of West Palm. We discussed with the city commission. So there's lots of conversation up front to understand what are the sensitivities, what are people nervous about, and what steps do we need to introduce to be sure that folks are comfortable and that we're respecting their data appropriately. So in that particular project, I want to talk about a few different things we're doing to safeguard privacy. So the first is that as an operating principle, every piece of data that we collect in that project is publicly available from the moment we collect it. So anything we collect is public. It is not private. It's not being sold. It's not being redistributed. It's all public data. So that's part one. Part two is that we never collect user data of any kind. So when someone tells you, I'm listening to the signal that comes from your cell phone, this makes us very, very nervous, and rightfully so. But the data that's being collected in this case is only the beacon. So I want to drill down into that a little bit. When you have your cell phone, my cell phone has its Wi-Fi turned on, and right now it's sending out a beacon asking whether or not there's an access point that it can connect to. And within that beacon, it includes a number that identifies this particular phone, but not me. It's that number that we listen for. We take that number, we push it through something called a one-way hash function, which turns it into another number that can never be reversed to identify this particular phone. And it's only that number that's stored. So I think a natural follow-on question is a system like this applicable to policing? And the answer is no, because the information we collect is only about where this device is now, and the number that we ultimately store can never be used to identify this device. So everything is secure by design. Now, more broadly in the Internet of Things, how do we safeguard privacy? How do we safeguard our data? We're very fortunate at FAU to have a world-class team that's focused on next generation cryptography. So these are new mathematical tools, new electrical engineering designs, new computer engineering designs, all focused on how do we, as computers become faster and faster and more capable of sort of code breaking, how do we ensure that our devices can protect our information and keep it private? And so that's work that's led by Reza Azardarok's team in the post-quantum group here at FAU.
Great. Thank you. You mentioned a little bit about the future of IoT. Can you speak a little bit more on how you envision? You had the Back to the Future video or photo there. Can you put your lens on and look maybe 10, 20 years in the future and how you would envision IoT working then?
Yeah, so I'll make a comment about Back to the Future. So Back to the Future only goes to 2015. That's the furthest out it can go. I still don't have my hoverboard, and so I'm sort of disappointed in that outcome. If we look to the next 10 years or the next 20 years, we're going to see another big bang in wireless sensing and in IoT, and it's going to take on a form that looks very much like this futuristic vision called ubiquitous computing or pervasive computing. The idea behind pervasive computing is that sensing, computing, and communication can become so powerful, so small, so energy lean that it can be woven throughout everything around us, throughout our walls and our floors and the fabric of our clothes and our jewelry and everything else. And that we won't even see it, but that it has the ability to sense what's happening in the environment. It has the ability to compute and communicate. That's the future we're moving to. So what are the trends that get us there? So we're going to continue to see advances in the hardware technology to have very small devices that are ultra low power, that consume an embarrassingly small amounts of power to do the work that they do. So we're talking about picowatt operations. We're going to continue to see advancements in energy harvesting. So we're going to see devices that are we're no longer satisfied with just pulling in energy from solar panels. We're now pulling in energy from ambient RF, from just Wi-Fi signals. We're pulling in energy from the vibration of machines. We're pulling in energy from thermal differentials between our HVAC systems and outside, every possible ambient source. Now, when you have devices that consume just picowatts, like nothing basically, you don't need to harvest a lot of energy to keep those devices operating. So now what that gives you is the ability to have perpetual, everywhere sensing, computing, communication. So now you have a huge volume of data that's coming back. And so the next wave, and I think it's the wave we're at the forefront of right now, is continued advancements in machine learning and in infrastructure for machine learning and artificial intelligence to find patterns and trends within these very large data sets to not only provide more informed decision making, but to introduce autonomous adaptation of our environments. So I think the future in the next 10 to 20 years, if I have my Marty goggles on, I think that we're going to see sensors and computing devices that are quite powerful and so small we don't even know they're there. And there are examples of this already. We have computing devices that can be embedded in the eye. We have computing devices that can be embedded in the skin. So this technology we're starting to see, this is not just science fiction. This is the start of something that will really revolutionize what computing and engineering looks like.
Sounds like we're all going to turn into cyborgs. So ever since the implementation of the introduction of smartphones, and probably even before that, there was a concern that this increase in radiation, because you have all this radiation going on with especially with the sensors that you're mentioning, that where the data collection has to occur remotely somewhere, right? So you have to transmit the signal somehow through radiation. Are there any health concerns that you're aware of as we are getting more and more connected through this IoT?
So I don't know, but when I started, I had a lot more hair than I do now. So I don't know the answer to the question. I think that I actually don't know. I can tell you only what I've read. That's not my area of expertise. I'm not aware of any health concerns, and I don't have any expertise to answer the question.
Coming back to the security, which is on the forefront of our attendees here and their concerns. When you have a number, as you mentioned, affiliated with your phone or whatever you're using, your smart device, and that is the only thing that's being recorded, but that number could technically be connected to your location, right? And it typically is, because you also have, as you showed earlier, you can look at GPS coordinates, right? So if that is the case, if the number from your phone can be connected with a location, with an address, and it's very easy to go from there to the owner's ID. How do you prevent that information from publicly getting shared and protect the individuals from like stalkers or something like that, somebody like that?
Another really good question, and I'm going to answer it in two parts. So the first is that I just want to be sure that my comment on the one-way hash function was clear. So the idea behind a so-called one-way hash function is it's a math function that takes in some big number, some big long string of numbers, and it spits out another long string of numbers that is roughly guaranteed to be unique. The thing that's important about that function is there's no way to take the output and to reverse it. So once you take the number from my phone and I pass it through this one-way hash function, I have a new number which represents this device, but there is no way to confirm that correspondence. So that's part one. Part two, I think, though, gets to something incredibly important, and that is, let's just ignore the numbers for a second. So ignore these identifiers. So let's just say that we have dots on a map, they're unlabeled, there's no ID. But one of those dots on a map always goes into the same home. And let's just further say that that one dot that continues to go into the same house ends up going to a pharmacy. What can we infer? And the answer is we would be able to infer all kinds of things, which is why we limit our data collection only to public spaces. So we only collect information about public space behavior, and it is strictly anonymized dots on a map within those public spaces. So we do not track information about where people go within neighborhoods, and we don't track any identity or anything like that.
Okay, great. We are out of time. We do have a few more questions. We will collect those questions and have Dr. Hallstrom answer those offline and then post them together with a recording of this presentation on our website. And with that, I'll thank you, Dr. Hallstrom, and thank you for your attendance.
Thanks a lot. See you later.
Bye.
Bye-bye.